Okay.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Ziegler, and I work at the Research Innovation Office at the University of Guelph. Thank you for joining us today. Today's Advantage workshop is called Op-Ed Writing, and we're pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Saskia Broussard. Saskia is an expert in communications and focuses in the agriculture and agri-food sectors. Saskia worked with researchers for several years to help them craft their writing effectively. And today, Saskia will be telling us about how to craft our op-eds and tips on getting them published. So welcome, Saskia, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I hope everyone has got their coffee ready and is ready to learn about op-eds. Thanks, Kelly. I'm Saskia Broussard, and this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about what is an op-ed. Should you write an op-ed? Some tips on writing an op-ed in terms of structure. We're going to talk a little bit about ghostwriters, how to submit your op-ed, some do's and don'ts, how to deal with rejection. We're going to have a few examples, and we're also going to talk about some University of Guelph resources. So I wanted to start today with an example of an op-ed that my daughter wrote. She is in grade 3, and she had to write a persuasive opinion. The question was, what is the best candy? And this is what my daughter wrote. So the structure of an op-ed is essentially the same as what we are learning in grade 3, but we're going to try to level up a little bit. So let's talk about what is an op-ed. It's actually short for opposite the editorial. A lot of people think it means opinion editorial, but it's the actual, it comes from the phrase opposite the editorial. And it's a column that represents the strong, informed, and focused opinion of the writer on an issue. It can be written by anybody from experts to everyday people. It gives a fresh perspective on current events. Its goal is to be persuasive. And it's a little bit different than other types of things that people might submit. For example, letters to the editor, which we're also going to touch on today. Letters to the editor are often very short. They have less space, and they're often a response to something that's printed already in the newspaper. I'm just going to put just for a moment, put that up there. So here is a typical newspaper page. This is from the Seattle Times, and you can see the different placement on a newspaper. If you're reading an old school newspaper still, you'll see that there will be editorials, and those are written by the editorial board. Essentially, the byline often says editorial, the board. Then there are staff or syndicated columns. So there are often opinion pieces that are written by staff, and they will have a byline, or they'll say syndicated column. And then there's a guest column or an op-ed. And these are the pieces that we are talking about today. These are the pieces that are written by members of the community. And often they will say special to the star or guest columnist. And then you also have letters to the editor, which are, as I mentioned, responses to previously published news or other opinion articles. So let's talk about if you should even be writing an op-ed. Here are some questions to ask yourself. First question is, do you have a clear, well-informed, well-formed opinion? And so if you don't really have a strong opinion about something, then probably an op-ed is not the best format for you. So it's important to have a clear, well-formed opinion. So here's a quote from Jonathan Rick, who is an op-ed ghostwriter, and he says, an op-ed isn't a narrative or a rumination. Those genres are fine, but they're not op-eds. If you don't have a clearly definable argument, you're not writing an op-ed, you're writing an essay or an article. So just make sure that your contribution has a very clear point of view. The next thing that you should consider if you're going to write an op-ed is, do you have credibility on this topic? So in the previous slide, I said that op-eds can be submitted by just about anyone, members of the community or experts, but often they are written by prominent members of the community, people that are experts in their field. And but this is not always the case. So in whatever the case is, you should have credibility. Readers need to be able to trust you, and you need to be able to back up what you're saying. So if you're an expert on gardening, and then you can write an op-ed about gardening. If you're an expert on a certain topic, then that's okay too. The next thing you need to consider is if you're willing to criticize others, and do you have a solution? So we've heard the term, don't bite the hand that feeds you. And a lot of times I'm working with a client who wants to do an op-ed, but they're unwilling to really go in and criticize, for example, the government or a political party or an association, and they don't want to necessarily put their neck out there on the line. So op-eds are maybe not the right format for you if you're not willing to take that kind of risk. And then also in an op-ed, often you'll if you're criticizing something, you need to have a solution. So if you don't know what the solution is, it's probably not a good idea to write the op-ed. Also, you need to consider if you're willing to stir up controversy. So in op-eds, controversial, provocative, or contrarian viewpoints are more likely to grab the editor's attention. So the question you have to ask yourself is, can you take the heat? If you write something that's going to be very controversial or provocative, you might get some pushback about that. And this is one of the things I think is the most important, which is, will you be the first? Op-eds, they are getting, op-ed editors are getting a lot of contributions, and I'm going to touch on that in later in the presentation. But you need to be the first, really. You need to be the best opinion. You need to be often, something that will stand out, but often the first. And sometimes they just simply take the first op-ed that is submitted. So if there's breaking news, waiting even a few days to respond to this breaking news may be too late. And so often op-eds are actually written weeks in advance of what we know will be breaking news. For example, if the government is going to be announcing a budget and you want to get your op-ed in early, you can actually submit it 2 or 3 weeks before that news will happen. So let's talk about getting started. So the length of an op-ed is typically quite short, somewhere between 650 and 800 words. And most newspapers will actually specify how long they want the op-ed to be. So no more than 800 words or between 700 and 800 words. Sometimes that's even too long. Newspapers they are not always have a lot of space available. And so they're not always looking for pieces that are really, really long. And just note that the editors do often reserve the right to edit and condense contributions. So this is a little bit different from a letter to the editor, which is often 250 words or less. In fact, some of them are 50 words. I mean, really, you can just send a sentence or two. So let's get a little bit more into the structure. So in terms of openings, let's talk about the title. So it's important to choose a strong title for your piece, knowing that the editor may decide to change it. So you can still, take a stab at writing the headline, but know that it probably will get changed. But it still pays to grab the attention. So I wanted to share a couple of examples here. Here's one from the Toronto Star that was written by Timothy Dewhurst. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And I think this is someone who is a University of Guelph person. And he wrote, in these uncertain times, some marketing appears overly optimistic or desperate. So I'm not sure if Timothy wrote this or if the Toronto Star wrote this, but it definitely catches attention. And here's another one. This one was written by Evan Fraser. And the headline is The COVID-19 Pandemic and Canada's Food System. So short and sweet. So as part of the opening, there's the section called the lead, and it's what sets the scene and grabs your reader's attention. It's your introduction, and it's often about 100 words. It briefly lays the foundation for your argument. It tells readers very high up in this piece, so in those first 100 words, why they should care. And it leads to your thesis argument, which is explicitly stated or implied. So openings involve that lead, which is that hook, which captures attention, some context, which is what helps explain what the issue is at hand. So it explains a little bit, and then it puts forward your thesis or your argument. Where do you stand on the issue? So here's an example, also from Evan Fraser, from this piece that he contributed, which started off by saying, in the past week, many Canadians were confronted with a scene that was entirely new to them. And it goes on to say, empty grocery store shelves evoke the image of a society sliding into the precipice of wartime rations and of the zombie apocalypse. But for all of this concern, this is generated, at least 3 key points should stand out. So when you're working on the lead, often you're referencing something in the news, you're marking an anniversary, you're making a strong claim, you might state a surprising fact. People don't realize that this, etc. You might use a metaphor, you might share a mystery, you might point out a contradiction or make a counterintuitive observation, or you might cite a major study. Last week a study revealed that, whatever, and then you comment on that. So as you get into the body of your op-ed, you'll have your main argument as well as your facts and sources. So at this point, it's important to flesh out your main argument. This is going to be around 3 to 5 paragraphs, and it's going to be based on evidence and solid research. So this is going to include things like statistics, news reports from credible organizations, expert quotes, history, firsthand experience. It's going to have facts, quotations, citations, and data from sources. So they're going to really be able to support that argument that you're making. So when you're supporting your argument, a lot of op-eds really follow that clear point that my daughter was tasked with to write her little opinion piece, her persuasive opinion, which is a first point, a second point, and a third point. And each point needs to be supported with evidence, where you might have your facts, your anecdotes, your support to bolster your points. And then at each first point, you will follow with a conclusion. It's very similar to essay writing. So here's another example from Evan, and this is where his piece went on to say, the first is we should not panic. And then he goes on to talk more about this point. He includes a quote here. Galen Weston of Loblaw wrote on March 16th, we are not running out of food or essential supplies. Our supply chain and store teams are responding to the spikes in volume, ... So again, he's bolstering his point with a quote. The to be sure paragraph is where you preempt your potential critics by acknowledging any flaws in your argument or address any obvious counter arguments. So they often call this the to be sure paragraph. Sometimes it makes its way into that third point, and sometimes it stands alone. And not every op-ed has this, but typically it's part of the structure. So in terms of endings, you're going to echo or answer your introduction. It's often the last and most memorable detail. It often calls the readers to action, says, now we need to go out and do this or do that. It proposes change. And it circles back to your lead, wraps it all up and with a nice pretty bow. And here you're often repeating your main argument in a new way. This is often where you also propose a solution. So here's the example from Evan Fraser, and he wrote, to close, Canadians worried about the security of their food system in light of COVID-19 shouldn't panic. So here are some criteria when you're evaluating your op-ed. So you might want to ask yourself, do you get to the point? The opinion piece, so if you're going to evaluate, you're looking at if the opinion piece has an original, well-argued point. The piece draws the reader into looking at the topic in a new way or with new insight. The reader can readily summarize what the author is saying and why. Is it persuasive? Does the reader come away from reading the piece feeling that the author has effectively argued for a certain point? The author uses concrete examples that resonate with the readers. Looking at the hook and the structure, the main point is effectively stated in the first few sentences. These first few sentences capture the reader's attention and draw the reader into reading further. The author effectively summarizes the piece's arguments in a strong final paragraph. You're also going to look at the writing and clarity. Is the writing clear? The author's own voice and perspective comes through in a convincing way. You can identify with the author and the position that she or he takes. And there are obviously no grammatical mistakes that distract from the author's argument. And the tone. Is the opinion piece polite and respectful in tone? Rather than dismissing the other side, does it acknowledge its value while disagreeing with it? Does it come across as written by a thoughtful professional versus the subject, versed in the subject being discussed? So these are some of the criteria you might ask yourself. And if you bring your op-ed to a colleague to have them read it to provide this criteria. Let's talk about some do's and don'ts. So I reached out to a number of opinion editors from major newspapers across the country, as well as the CBC, and I heard back from a CBC opinion editor, Ian Johnson. And I'm going to provide throughout this presentation a few of his pieces of information that he provided to me. He wrote to me that columns are more likely to be published if they are thought-provoking pieces about timely topics. They need to be clearly written with well-reasoned and well-supported arguments. They must also be unique, original columns that haven't been published elsewhere. And while a pitch that takes the same stand on an issue as a column CBC has already published won't make the cut, we welcome alternative perspectives and arguments regarding issues that have appeared in CBC opinion columns. So really, he's talked about it being timely as well. That's very important. So let's talk about some do's and don'ts. So when it comes to do's, language. It's important that it's written in strong, lively language, and keep your sentences and paragraphs short and simple. So it's important not to use terms that will be, in terms of difficult for readers to read. As I mentioned before, it's important for it to be timely. You need to be the first. And often you tie your piece to the strongest possible news peg. So if you think about what's going on in the news today, your piece should be related to something that is happening. You might want to deliver it days ahead of that event if possible. Days or even weeks, actually. So you need to have facts. You need to weave in relevant facts and statistics to bolster your case, but not too many to overwhelm it. You can use anecdotes and examples to illustrate your point. And you can also submit a graphic if you have one. And I liked this particular piece that was submitted by another professor, I believe, at the University of Guelph. And it was about the fly on Mike Pence's head. And the author looked at how the fly was often represented in art throughout history and submitted this great couple of great pictures of pieces of art where there was a notable fly. Other thing that is a do is do focus on solutions. If you're focusing on a problem, propose ways to fix it. So here's some more insight from the CBC. CBC looks for opinion columns that clearly state the author's perspective, position, or desired course of action on a timely issue of interest to Canadian readers. And then they need to back up with well-reasoned arguments. In other words, besides stating what the author thinks about an issue, we want them to give context about why they hold that point of view, what actions, changes, etc. they'd like to see, and why those actions would be beneficial. So another do is to try reading your column out loud to someone to get a sense of the voice and how it is being heard. If it sounds like a rant, it might be a rant. It's a couple of don'ts. So steer clear of academic jargon and technical terms. Really, it needs to be at a grade, I was going to say a grade 8 or 9 level, but maybe even a grade 6 or 7 level. Certainly, I think, grade 9 would be the right type of writing, grade 9 writing. So it's important to just, if you're using academic jargon or technical terms, to try to strip those and use common language. And of course, it's not an opportunity to rant. A lot of people have opinions, but you need to be able to back them up. So in terms of a checklist, before you submit, here's another little checklist for you. Is it clear? Is there clarity? Is there coherence and unity? Is it simple? You'll look at its voice and tone. Make sure that you've properly credited all of your sources. And is your opinion consistent throughout the piece? So let's talk now about submitting your op-ed, some tips. So most newspapers, they do post their guidelines as well as an email address for submitting op-eds electronically, along with detailed instructions. Every opinion piece, every opinion page that I've seen across the country, they have fairly detailed instructions listed right there with the other opinion pieces on how you can submit your opinion piece, including how long they want it, when to submit, the email to submit it to. Most of the time, when you're sending your actual op-ed in an email, to actually include it as text in the body of an email. A lot of media outlets actually won't open things with attachments because of all the issues that they have with spyware, etc. So just really include it right in the body of your email. And some newspapers may ask for a photo of you if you have a headshot. So make sure you have something like that available, and you might want to include that as well in your pitch. Again, it's an attachment, so maybe wait to see if they're going to run it, and then they might follow up asking for a photo. To make sure you include your contact information and a brief line on your credentials. And usually it's a sentence. So, you're the professor or at the University of Guelph, whatever it is that you have for your credentials. So here's an example from the Toronto Star, and they have their instructions here. You can all read this here. I have to put my glasses on to read this. But it says to submit an opinion article for consideration. So it says if you want to submit an opinion article for consideration, please send it to oped@thestar.ca. We consider commentaries of 600 to 725 words on current affairs, with an emphasis on, I believe that says Canadian issues. We tend not to print personal essays or broadly themed philosophical, religious, or historical articles, I think that says. We also print very little in the way of humor and satire. So I wanted to touch on that very few op-eds are actually humorous or satirical. They're really much more fact and argument based. Writers must include their credentials and are expected to have expertise in the area they are discussing. If they have involvement in or a connection with an issue that is not apparent from the credentials or the content of the article, you must disclose that to the star. And I'm going to touch on that as well, because there are some issues around transparency and ethics that you need to consider when submitting an op-ed. Please include a recent color, head and shoulders photo with your submission, and a mailing address. Probably it says all contributors whose articles are selected for publication will be asked to sign a freelance agreement giving the star the right to publish the material online and other formats. And it says here, be aware that we receive dozens of submissions a week and can print only a few. We try to inform contributors within 48 hours whether we are interested in printing their articles, but it can be ... I don't know what it says, when volume is particularly heavy. So I've reached out to the star, and they actually said that they can receive up to 50 and sometimes even more submissions per week. And so they're looking at a lot of opinion pieces, and many of those submitted by people that are thought leaders in their area. So you're competing with a lot of other people. It's not just a few. There can be 50, 60, even 100 contributions each week. So it's fierce competitor. So here's a couple of pages just to get a sense of what the opinion pages look like. Here's one from the Globe and Mail. And you can see here that they have editorials, letters to the editor, and then columnists. So they actually make it a little bit more clear whose opinion you're reading. And the Globe and Mail, they have also provided their submission requirements. And they actually have another area of the newspaper I wanted to highlight, which are called first person submissions. And the first person essay, it was formerly called Facts and Arguments, you may recall. And this is where it's more of a forum to share your experiences, viewpoints, and writing flair. So it's more of an essay, but I just wanted to highlight this. If you have something that is more of an essay rather than an opinion piece, there are some other opportunities to submit those pieces to the Globe and Mail first person. And I often look at this section to see if there's an opportunity for someone I'm working with to submit an essay about their experience. So it's more personal rather than political, and they're true, not fictional. And I just want to make note, here's the Globe and Mail instruction for letters to the editor. Letters to the editor should be exclusive to the Globe and Mail. So you can't go and submit that to all of the newspapers across the country. And you have to include your name, address, and daytime phone number, and keep it fewer than 150 words. It also might be edited for length and clarity, and you can send those to letters@theglobeandmail.com. Kelly, do we have any questions so far?
Not in the chat. Does anyone have any questions right now? I actually had one, Saskia.
Sure.
I was wondering, can you write sort of variations of the same op-ed? Like for this example, for this slide that you're showing, can you submit it to different publications sort of at different times or slightly different pieces?
I think if you're submitting it to, for example, different provincial publications, and you're focusing each article on the matter at hand in that province, so customizing it for Ontario, and then you have another opinion piece that's similar but about the issue in Alberta, and you're submitting that to the Calgary Herald, then yes. But generally, it's hard to just tweak it a little bit. The Globe and Mail really wants sort of ownership over that op-ed, and so if you're really thinking of the Globe and Mail, you really need to wait for a rejection before maybe approaching another one.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
I am going to touch a little bit on the conversation because that's actually being picked up by other publications now. I'll actually touch on that in a moment. So, I mean, I think generally the rule is, yes, if it's a really separate article custom for that publication, but just sort of tweaking one or two facts, probably no.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. And we actually do have some questions in the chat. Would you like me to read them to you, Saskia?
Yes, please. Thanks.
So Richard is asking, what is a columnist?
A columnist is a person who's actually paid by the newspaper to write a weekly, often a weekly or daily column. And the columnist is a little bit different than someone who is a reporter. Reporter is reporting facts. A columnist will actually include their opinion.
Okay. Perfect. And then I'll read the second question from Paul Anglin. He says, thank you for your thoughts. Can you clarify what it means to write persuasively? Academics tend to think that requires 5,000 words, not 500 pages.
Yeah. I mean, the idea about being persuasive is using language that is very concise, but is going to convince someone of your point of view. And you have to do that by incorporating your facts, your points to bolster and support your point. It's not enough to just say your opinion. You need to support that opinion with facts, anecdotes, quotes, sources, a study to help convince people that your opinion is the right opinion.
Thank you for that. And Paul, I would like to point out, you can talk to experts like Saskia, and we also have support available at the Research Innovation Office. If you would ever like someone to sort of review your writing for clarity, but to also make sure that it's persuasive.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions for Saskia?
I'll continue on.
Oh, we have one more from Sue. She asks, can you go back to the idea of how many outlets to send your op-ed to? Sure.
And I'm going to touch on this as well. And I think one of the slides coming up, I'm motoring through these slides, so we might actually end up a little bit early. But typically you're sending it to one. So you're choosing one destination and you will send it to them and give them 48 hours to respond. Often you can say that I'm sending this exclusively to the Globe and Mail, and I will wait to hear from you. If I don't hear from you within 48 hours, I will submit it to another publication. And typically, if your piece is being picked up, they are going to be in touch with you within hours, if definitely within hours, within a day or two of you submitting. And then you can go on, once you've received a refusal, you can go on and send that. But there's actually a little bit of an exception. People do sometimes submit it to multiple publications and then wait to hear back from one. And then you'd have to, if they were picked up, then you would have to inform all the other papers, I'm sorry, I've decided to publish this. The Globe and Mail's picked this up, so thanks, but no thanks. So it's a bit tricky to do that, but I know some people will do that. I'm not in favor of doing it that way. I think it's better to send it to one and wait to see if they pick it up. You'll know very quickly if they're going to pick it up or not. Rather than having to submit it to multiple publications and then retract it.
Okay. Thank you, Saskia.
Okay. We'll continue on here. So here's actually a little bit of information about the conversation. I actually really enjoy. There's, I don't know if everybody else here signed up for the conversation. It's a site that really promotes academic researchers, the work of academic researchers, and So it's a news site where academic researchers work with journalists to create research-based op-eds, and they can be picked up by major newspapers across Canada. So here's a little blurb that the Conversation actually prints on their site. It says, to be published by the Conversation, you must be currently employed as a researcher or academic with a university or university-affiliated research institution. PH candidates under supervision by an academic can write for us, but we don't currently publish articles from master students. So this is an excellent place. Again, they're not publishing hundreds of pieces. It's still a couple a day, a few a day, but there are some really interesting pieces, and I've seen these get picked up more and more by other major newspapers across Canada. So I would suggest, that if you aren't signed up for the Conversation, that you sign up for it and check out some of the opinion pieces they're currently running. Lots of interesting articles are coming out there each morning. I just wanted to mention about the Toronto Sun. So they actually don't seem to have an op-ed section, which is interesting. They do have letters to the Toronto Sun editor. I couldn't find they do have opinion pieces, but they're mostly columnists, so paid, syndicated columnists or columnists that are writing for the newspaper on a regular basis. I couldn't really, at least it wasn't obvious to me if there were opinion pieces that were submitted. You could always, reach out to the editor and, submit something if you wanted to have something published in a Post Media or the Toronto Sun. But they do accept letters, and they have to be very short. I think they're maybe 150 words for the Toronto Sun. Don't forget all of the other newspapers, the regional newspapers across the country, for example, the Ottawa Citizen, that's also Post Media, but they do accept opinion pieces, and they're asking for a clear, concise opinion backed by a logical argument and strong writing in about 600 to 630 words. Offering solutions to a problem you have identified also lead to a stronger piece. So you'll see most newspapers do have a section like this where you can submit, and it's great to check it out. Now, if you are going to pitch something to the Ottawa Citizen, often they're going to be looking for something that is related to Ottawa. So writing your article for an Ottawa audience, even though it's Post Media, so it could be picked up across the chain if there was a strong national piece. So the National Post, this is basically what a rejection letter or what a confirmation of receipt email will look like, and this might be all that you got. So just so you're not shocked, you might just have, thank you for contacting us. We are not currently responding manually to unsolicited pitches for op-eds. However, your email has been received and op-ed pitches will be reviewed. Basically, don't call us, we'll call you. And here they're saying that if you haven't been contacted within 3 days, you should assume that your work will not be published. So let's look at the CBC opinion page. They typically publish about a dozen opinions, opinion columns, and point of view personal essays per week from across Canada. You can check them out at cbc.ca/news/opinion. And they actually receive about 150 submissions. So of those, less than 10% are picked up. But they also have regional bureaus that receive more localized pitches. So if you're pitching something related to, Peterborough, it might be picked up by CBC in that particular region. They only accept op-eds from individual writers expressing a personal opinion. We don't publish open letters or columns submitted on behalf of groups or schools. So, and they say individual writers, but sometimes op-eds do have a byline with 2 or 3 people, but they're not, submitted on behalf of, say, the University of Guelph. The ideal length is 500 to 700 words, and you just submit it to opinion@cbc.ca. So someone is there at cbc.ca reading about 150 submissions a week, and then they're selecting from those about a dozen, which is still a good number. So I would really consider looking at CBC for opportunities to publish your opinion. I think it's probably statistically a little bit easier to get into the CBC Opinion page rather than the Globe and Mail. Globe and Mail is tough. So I think it's important to ask yourself, is the issue that you're writing about, is it a national issue or is it a regional or local issue? If it's national, you can submit it to a publication like the Globe and Mail or the Conversation. If it's regional, you might consider a smaller provincial or community paper. But it's important to make sure that your article is written in a way that is relevant to that region. So you might mention, the local government, the local provincial government rather than the federal government, and using local stats or facts and information to bolster your points. The good news is it's often a little bit easier to get picked up by a regional newspaper rather than a major one. But the bad news is a lot of these outlets, from what I can see, are only publishing shorter letters. So they're only accepting these letters to the editor rather than op-eds. This is more, they're accepting letters that are in response to articles that they're already printing, but not sort of separate opinion pieces. And that's just the state of the media today. They're just really cut their space, and there's not as many opportunities, which I think is on another issue is challenging for Canada. You also have to consider media bias. So many newspapers, they openly lean a little bit left or a little bit right or a lot left or a lot right. And so it's important that you know the outlet. If you're writing for Post Media, it's going to be more on the right. If you're going to write for the Toronto Star, it's going to be a little bit more on the left. So it's important to research the publication, maybe read the opinion section and look for some insight on the content that the publication is most likely to publish. So it's, if you're planning to write an opinion piece, spend a few days or weeks just reading the opinion pieces that are published every day and seeing the kind of stuff that's getting picked up. So since we had questions about this already, just a little bit more in depth on exclusivity. So many publications, they do insist on original content. So if it can't be published anywhere, and that is including your own personal publishing platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook, Medium, a personal blog, of course, sharing it with other media outlets. So they don't want to see it published anywhere. And so prior to submitting an essay for publication, consideration, understand whether exclusivity is required, and then honor that publication's preferences. So don't approach a second publication until you've been declined. You may stipulate at the top of your piece that you will offer it elsewhere if you don't hear back within a certain period of time, for example, 48 hours. And basically you can assume they aren't interested if they don't get back to you. I know everybody thinks, like, did they read it? Is it lost? But really, they had 150 of them that week. They picked the first few, and that's all that they're going to do. So that said, I did hear back from the CBC, and the fellow there, he did say that some writers submit only one publication at a time, and others submit it to many publications simultaneously, noting this in their pitch, and then work with the first one to respond to them with an interest in publishing. So that's not typically how I've worked, but I think it's, the CBC is saying that is how some people do operate. So every submission is reviewed, but they can't personally respond to every pitch. So it is hard to sort of work really hard on this opinion piece, and you've gone through all the process, and then you submit it and it just goes into this, dark black hole. But it has been reviewed, and if they have space for it and it's the first and it's really well written, then you might be lucky. So they do have this auto, as noted on the email, auto confirmation when the editor will be in touch within 48 hours if CBC wants to make arrangements to pursue it. I asked the CBC opinion editor if you could send an outline of your opinion piece, because I mean, they take a lot of work, and you feel like if you've gone through that work and you've spent the time editing it and making sure it's great, backing up your sources, and then it's not even published, it's so disappointing. But could you just send a sort of preview of what you're going to write? And he did say, yes, you could do that, but really they still couldn't judge whether or not they'll pick it up or not unless they actually see the final written piece. So it sounds like more or less you have to, take the risk, write the piece, and then hope for the best. I wanted to touch a little bit about ghostwriters. So they're much like speechwriters. They are often former journalists. Sometimes they're PR people, and they will write a piece with your byline or your name attached. And sometimes they're commissioning you to write a piece, which will have your byline. So a ghostwriter, it can be a journalist who can help you research and help develop your argument or edit your piece to just bring it up to those journalistic standards. And I think that's good, and that's okay if you have, a friend who's a journalist, or you want to hire someone to help you with your opinion piece and really make it, great. That is certainly something you can consider. But I think it's important to also remember that it's your credibility on the line. It needs to be still in your voice. And because we know that if there's breaking news, they're going to pick the op-ed that is the first. You need to be able to move really fast. So, if you're working with another ghostwriter, it might slow this process down. And then I think there's a big issue around ethics and disclosure. Who is really behind it, and were you paid to provide the byline? Meaning, did a PR firm reach out to you, or that's representing a pharmaceutical company, and they want you to write an opinion piece that is criticizing the government, but really it's the pharmaceutical company or the PR person, PR agency's client that is looking for you to write it. And this has become a real issue actually with op-eds, where people are just hiring ghostwriters to write really great pieces, and then give it a byline to someone who will be paid to actually put their name on it. That will, often is more political in nature. So I think that, there's certainly an ethics issue here. And on The Conversation, they actually include this disclosure statement with every op-ed piece. And this is one from Sally Hickson. It says, Sally Hickson does not work for, consult, own, shares in, or receive funding from any company or organization that would benefit from this article, and has disclosed no relevant affiliations beyond their academic appointment. So, op-ed is really, The Conversation is really looking for this kind of disclosure. And, this is the standard, I think, that, should be there for all newspapers. But we know, I'm in PR, I know that, this is not always happening. And there are op-ed pieces that are being bylined where, there's maybe some ethical considerations that aren't being disclosed. So I think it's important to be transparent. So let's talk a little bit about rejection. So you you've submitted, you've worked so hard, you've bolstered all of your points, you've got the evidence, you've written it, and you've read it out loud, you've written an amazing piece, and you submit it and you don't hear anything back, and 48 hours has passed. So now what? So disappointing. And so, I think it's important to keep in mind that newspapers, they're flooded with far more submissions than they can possibly print. You could try to follow up with them or another editor. If you have a connection to an editor, that could always help. There are opinion editors, at least at some of the major newspapers. There's someone that is the opinion editor, and you can get a hold of their email and send them, a more personal email. But generally, they're going to write back, and either they're not going to write back because they've received 150 submissions and they're not going to personally get back to everybody. But if you do have a connection or someone. But at the end of the day, if you haven't heard back after 2 to 3 days, try another publication and just make sure that it's been tailored and tweaked for that publication. And then, there are other places to post your opinion. You might have a self-publishing site. It might be your website, a blog, or a newsletter. You could publish it to LinkedIn. You could publish it to social media. So there are other places to still post your opinion. I also think there is some benefit to submitting a few times to a newspaper so that the editors can start to, if they see your name coming up again, here's another piece written by this person, they get a little bit more familiar with who you are. The fact is, often when you see opinion pieces, they are written by, fairly well-known people. If it's going to be an opinion piece that's written by, someone who is nationally or internationally known, has a high profile, they'll often pick up that piece rather than someone who is less well known. So it is difficult. I wanted to point out a few examples from the University of Guelph that were sent to me, and I read some of these. They were great. And the University of Guelph also published them on their site, and there's a note saying this was previously published in, The Conversation or in the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star. And you can read some of these headlines here. So there was the one about, in these uncertain times, some marketing appears overly optimistic or desperate. And there's another piece there about Mike Pence and The Fly, and another one by Professor Amy Greer. Kelly?
And Saskia, I would just like to point out that we actually have Timothy Dewhurst on the call today.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
So I've used yours as an example. Great.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
And there's a question, but maybe I will read it to you after you're finished, Saskia.
Yeah, and I'm just about wrapping up here. It looks like we might be ending up a little bit early, but here's some University of Guelph resources. So there's Deirdre Healy, who's the news service manager with the University of Guelph, and she is a key contact on campus who can connect faculty with editors and media to help you pitch. Some communication staff. There's also a University of Guelph media guide where you enter your address of focus so media can contact you with questions. This is actually a great database. A lot of journalists like to know about this media guide. It often comes up in conversation where they're looking for experts. This is not obviously an op-ed necessarily. This is other ways where you might be quoted in an article or interviewed. And then I don't know what is SPARK, Students Promoting Awareness of Research Knowledge. Kelly, do you know what SPARK is? I actually don't have a lot more details about that.
I'll jump in, Saskia.
Yeah.
So SPARK are undergraduate and graduate students that actually write articles of interest related to research at the University of Guelph. So they'll, it could be a researcher that's partway through their project getting some really cool results. It could be traction on what happened after the research was done in the real world. So these are budding journalists that are led by Liz Snyder, used to be Owen, and they get to practice writing articles. And so they're given a little bit more time, but essentially it's U of G promotion of our value and our research on, at the university. And yeah, so.
Okay.
Did I miss anything there, Liz? Sorry, Elizabeth. If I did, chime in.
No, I think that sounds good. Thanks, David. Sorry, I'm having some unmuting problems. And Christine points out too in the chat that there's also Scribe in CBS in the College of Biological Sciences, which sounds similar to Spark. So there's lots of great resources on campus that you can go to.
Elizabeth, also, you had sent me some information about some upcoming workshops. Does anybody want to comment about these workshops?
Yeah, Saskia, I can jump in here just to let both the faculty on the call and the students know that we have different series of workshops on this topic. So Skills for Research Impact is a knowledge mobilization series of 5 workshops that take place every semester during the fall and the winter. We have one coming up this afternoon that's an hour and a half just on how to write in clear language with a lot of practice. So it might be something to look up if you have the time or if you'd like to pass it along to students in your lab. It's just really some professional development to give you some experience and training in how to do things like engage with stakeholders and write in clear language and disseminate research. Advantage workshops similarly are workshops such as this one that are offered by the Research Innovation Office, and they're on topics again like clear language writing or op-eds and that kind of thing. They're meant to give you as faculty the tools you need to create innovative products to share your research and get it out there.
Great. And I think that wraps up. So I actually wrapped up a little bit early today. Everybody has a little bit extra time for coffee.
That's always good. Thank you so much, Saskia. That was a great presentation.
Thank you for having me. If there are any follow-up questions, feel free to email me, saskia@cravepr.com. And does anybody have any further questions in the comments?
I'll read out one of Sue's questions. She's asking, is there any sense of what day of the week is best to submit your piece to increase the chances of getting your work published? Like, for example, if they're starting to receive and choose pieces on Monday, would it be best to like submit your article first thing Monday or the Friday before?
I don't have any evidence that there's one day of the week that is better than others. I mean, they have to put out a newspaper, just about every day. So they're going to pick a number of pieces. And remember, most of those pieces often are submitted 2 to 3 weeks before. So they're scheduling them in for when they have these openings, or it's a breaking issue and they're really looking at the first piece that was submitted for that, that's talking about that breaking issue. So there's no specific day of the week that I've observed that, they're running, for example, more pieces that day or there's less competition. I think it's just very competitive to get your opinion piece picked up in general.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for Saskia at this time?
Okay. Cool. No? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day today. And I hope that you'll be inspired to maybe start working on an op-ed. There's lots of news happening at always. So, if there's an opportunity and you want to use that opportunity to get your op-ed piece pushed out there, maybe printed, good luck with that. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Have a great day.